Here's a question for you. If World War II ended in 1945, why was Ford still building a pre-war design in 1948? Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a wonderful collection, more than 170 cars, and all of them have interesting stories, and not just about the automotive world, but sometimes what's going on in the world at large. And this 1948 Ford is a really good example of that. But before we get to this car, make sure you like and subscribe down below, and also in the comments, let me know what I got right, what I got wrong. And this week, I want to know, where are you at right now? Where are you watching this from? Also, what kind of videos, what type of cars do you want to see? You know, we have more than 170 here, spanning the full spectrum from some of the earliest automobiles to modern exotics. So what interests you? Is it 40s, 50s, 60s, big cars, small cars, odd cars? Let me know in the comments down below. All right, now let's talk about this 1948 Ford, because this is really the end of the era. The pre-war design still being built in post-World War II America. And we really have to look at what was going on not just with Ford, but with the other automakers as well. During the 1940s, Ford's production shifted dramatically because of World War II. Now, before the war, Ford was focused on civilian vehicles. But once the United States entered the conflict in 1941, well, the company, like all the other automakers, redirected much of its manufacturing towards military needs. But that really wasn't completely by choice. On January 1st, 1942, all sales of cars, as well as the delivery cars, even to customers who'd previously contracted them, ordered them, were frozen by the government's Office of Production Management. Representatives from the auto industry then formed something called the Automotive Council for War Production. That happened in April of 1942. The idea was to help with the sharing of resources, expertise, and manpower in defense production contracting. Imagine that, all the car companies working together. Ford pivoted and started building a wide range of war materials, including the B-24 Liberator bombers, and they used their assembly line techniques on a massive scale to help the war effort. The company also built military trucks, jeeps, aircraft engines, other essential equipment to support the Allied forces. And not only did car companies have to adapt, but wartime policies also made car ownership more difficult and expensive. There were gas rations, tire restrictions. Despite complaints about the restrictions, officials required car owners to use their vehicles carefully and not very often. So when World War II ended, it brought more than just peace. It brought a return to driving in a world without restrictions. The first post-war Fords were introduced in 1946, but while Ford and the other automakers were ready to build, well, they really didn't have anything new ready for production. You know, they'd been just a little bit busy during the war years. So what buyers got in 1946 was basically the same car that they would have bought in 1942. In fact, it was the same car that they'd get in 47 and 48. So why did it take so long to come out with the 1949 new Ford? And why were they still building this body style in 1948? Well, the reality is there were a lot of factors involved, but a couple big ones come to mind. The first one is you have to remember their factories had been completely repurposed. They were no longer set up for building cars. They were set up for building military equipment. That had to be completely changed over. You had to get everybody back from World War II to start working on the car. And while I'm sure there were plenty of designers who in their foxholes were doodling and thinking about what they were going to come up with in terms of new styling, getting everybody back at the factory, back at Ford headquarters to work on those new designs really was time consuming. And then, of course, there was the idea that they simply wanted to get something new and different. That was going to take time. And the final factor was that there was so much pent-up demand after World War II for cars that the reality is people didn't care if they were buying a pre-war style in 46, 47, or 48. They were just happy that they were able to buy a car at all. Let's take a walk around and look at the styling of this 1948 Ford, the very end of the line before the 49 would come out. And boy, this thing just screams pre-war. Now, the advantage with Ford was they had come out with a new body style in 1941. So the front end of this car actually has a more modern look, I guess, than what they could have been stuck with if they'd had an older design. But it's also still very classic old school. These flat fenders coming up to this really tall peaked hood, kind of triangular shaped, as you can see, going up to the front. That Super Deluxe 6 emblem on the front, because this is a 6-cylinder. Talk more about that in just a moment. Now, I want to point out that here at the museum, in addition to having a 48 Ford, right next to it, we also have a 47 Ford. And on the other side, we have a 1946 Ford. And the great thing about this is we can show you how things change very little between 1946 and 1948. Now we've got some slight change in the turn signals right here as opposed to being down there where they are in the next couple years. Slight change too in terms of the emblem up front, but overall this styling was very similar to what you were going to be getting 2 years later. Now remember, this was in an era when things had to change every single year, so keeping that styling wasn't something they really wanted to do, it was something they were really more or less stuck with doing. But as I mentioned, the styling had changed in 1941. This particular body style came out. One thing that's intriguing right here, notice this little ridge right here. This is made to kind of have a stylized look of what a running board was. The previous body style, the one that ended in 1940, I think that was the end of the line for the running boards. But this one had this, well, metal-looking running board. Didn't need it, but you still had it just in case. By the way, I'm intrigued by these things right here. These are obviously to protect the fender. This one in the 46 have a rubberized one. The one next to it in the 1947 has bright work. I'm curious which one was factory or whether both were factory, one was an option. Let me know if you know the answer to that in the comments down below. This, of course, was the four-door version, F-O-R-D-O-R, but it also stood for 4 doors. Plenty of room in the back seat right there. But if you look at the back of these cars, boy, very similar from 1947, this one right here, to 1948. There are some subtle changes, though, between the 1947 and 48 and the 1946. This was the first style they came out with. So they made a few subtle changes between 46 and then 47 and 48. But overall, these cars were very, very similar in terms of what they were going to be producing and what people were going to be buying in the United States at that point in time. By the way, doesn't this look like that? I think, was it a Volvo 144, something like that, came out in the late 50s, early 60s, almost had that same styling that they used for a long time. Remember, everything was going to change big time in 1949. You know, it was going to get a completely different look up front. The fenders were going to smooth out. The hood was going to be much lower. Coming back to this 1948, though, this is what you got. That pre-war style that had come out in 1941 that they were still building all the way through 1948. In 1946, Ford sold 372,000 cars. That jumped to 601,000 in 1947 when this car came out. But it dipped slightly when this car came out in 1948 to 550,000. Why? Well, it's pretty obvious. The 1949 model was just on the horizon. When the 1949 model came out, they sold 840,000, more than 50% more than they sold in 1948. Well, if it wasn't much different outside, it really wasn't much different inside as well. This 1948 two-door model was very similar to what you were going to get in 47, 46, and in reality, almost identical to what you were going to get in 42. There were some subtle changes, though, between 1941 and 42, specifically in the dashboard. The 1941 dashboard has a slightly different dash than what you would see offered in 1942 and then continuing on through 1948. But what you got was a nice big wide bench seat up front. You got a nice big area in the back. In fact, the space in the back is huge room for people who are sitting in the back. It was great if you had that four-door version, or if you had this two-door version, well, you had plenty of leg room in the back. Controls were great. You know, it's interesting, the speedometer is just slightly offset, not in front of the driver, but just to the right, a little awkward in some ways. Speedometer on one side, clock on the other. I absolutely love this heater control down below. The vents that would open, almost looks like a mini refrigerator down here, but that's exactly how it was designed to make sure it was sending the temperature controlled air in just the right location. Still had the split in the windshield. That would last for just a little while longer. As I mentioned, has these big, huge roll-up windows in the back. Really intriguing to see how large they are. But honestly, it's really a very comfortable car when you get in. Now, it has a very high seating position, over the next few years, that was going to change and the seating position was going to go down. Looking back at this dashboard style, it's still kind of Art Deco-ish, if we can call it that, kind of remnants from the 30s going into the early 40s. But I have to say it's still very stylish. The radio up here, the speaker up here as opposed to down below as it would have been in some of the earlier years. But once again, everything you needed in a car, and once again, people in 1948, yeah, they were starting to look forward to the 1949, but so many people had been hanging on to a car for so long, and they just needed to get something new. And in the grand scheme of things, this was a very reliable, very well thought out, and very comfortable car. So while they might have wanted to wait for the 49, getting the 48 really wasn't a huge problem. The 1948 Ford came with two engine options. You get a 226 cubic inch inline six and a 239 cubic inch flathead Ford V8. Now, while the V8 got most of the attention, this inline six played a role, an important one, in the post-war lineup. The 226 cubic inch engine was part of a family of engines that was introduced by Ford in 1941. It had an L-head design, sometimes called the flathead design. In 1948, this engine produced 95 horsepower, made it up with a 3-speed transmission. It was pretty reasonable. Ford's first inline six engines were originally produced back in 1906, but they were discontinued in the late 1920s because Henry Ford thought, well, people had fours, they don't need sixes. They came back in the trucks in 1941, and by the mid-40s, the six-cylinder engine really became a good option for buyers who were looking for either something that was smoother or, more importantly, more economical compared to the V8. One of the differences between the 6 and the V8 was the power curve. The inline 6 produced less horsepower, but it delivered comparable torque at lower RPMs, which made it well suited for everyday driving or for light-duty commercial use. Now, in 1948, the year this car came out, they made 430,000 cars. About 30% of them were equipped with this engine, the inline 6. The other 70% got that flathead V8. The V8, of course, had brand recognition at the time, but the six-cylinder found a steady audience with drivers who valued reliability and, of course, easy maintenance. There really wasn't much that was mechanically unique about the 226 six-cylinder engine, but it was part of a broader shift in the industry. Ford's offering of a six-cylinder option aligned with what competitors like Chevy had been doing for years, giving buyers more flexibility in engine choice. Now, by 1952, Ford replaced this 226 engine with an overhead valve inline six, and that marked the end of the flathead six era. But in 1948, the 226 cubic inch engine helped round out the Ford lineup as the company really prepared for a major redesign that was going to happen in 1949. The shift from the 1948 to the 1949 Ford marked one of the most significant design transitions in the company's history. In 1949, Ford introduced a completely new car from the ground up. The body featured slab sides, had integrated fenders. It replaced that separate fender design of earlier models. The frame and suspension, they were also updated, had new coil spring suspension. It replaced that older transverse leaf spring they'd been using forever. Mechanically, the car still used, however, the same basic engines, that 226 inline six and the 239 Ford flathead V8, but the bodies themselves were lighter. They were more aerodynamic. The 1949 really was a clean break from the past, set a new tone for that post-war direction. But if you needed a car in 1948, what you got was something tried and true. The future may have been around the corner, but if you needed to go somewhere in 1948 and you needed a car right then and there, once again, this was going to get you there in a way you were very familiar with.